Today, MIT is a fixture of the Boston area skyline. Its iconic buildings, old and new, are recognized around the world as a source of bold ideas and groundbreaking discoveries that have transformed society and helped forge the modern era. But just over 100 years ago, none of this existed. MIT was not in Cambridge, but across the river in Boston. MIT was established in 1861 as a daring educational experiment, combining theoretical knowledge with hands-on learning to meet the needs of a growing industrial society. That experiment proved wildly successful, and MIT grew by leaps and bounds. But by the early 1900s, the Institute was at a crossroads. Facing an uncertain future in Boston, it would soon make one of the biggest leaps in its history.
This is a story of one institution having to completely redesign itself, and that redesign came with the building.
For about the first 55 years or so, MIT was in Boston, in Back Bay.
Copley Square was sort of the heartthrob of Boston, heartthrob of New England, in fact, a type of cognitive, spiritual core of America. Trinity Church, the library was built there, you had museums, you had important institutions all around Copley Square, including MIT. But it was just not enough room.
They have used every bit of land that they own. They can't build anymore. They can't lease any more space. There's people everywhere. There's noise. So the classrooms are tight and filled. There's no place for students to live.
And so it was just sort of bursting at the seams. The decision was made by the faculty that we're going to have to need a new campus, and also we're going to need a new president. So this is when McLaurin was brought in, a young man with huge amount of energy.
Richard Cockburn McLaurin, a man who'd been born in Scotland, had been raised in New Zealand. He's young, he's in his 30s. He's never run an institution, he doesn't solicit it. But they're so inspired by him and his words that they hire him.
He knew what the world needed, and he knew the impact MIT could have.
He has a broad vision. MIT isn't just building a new set of buildings to accommodate its space constraints. It's building a new set of buildings to make a statement to the world about the importance of science and technology education.
When the Institute was looking to expand out of the Back Bay, they were looking for large tracts of land.
They looked all around, but they couldn't find a suitable piece of property. Springfield, Mass. Said they'd consider it. Representatives of the city of Chicago said, you should consider Chicago.
President McLaurin looked across the river and saw this still undeveloped, newly filled neighborhood.
This is all fill from when they built the subways in Boston and they lowered Beacon Hill. Where we're sitting, the whole main group used to be underwater.
The Charles River Embankment Company had a plan to build up where MIT is as a luxury development. It had, these grand boulevards and these sort of, round circles and vistas, and it was really quite grand.
There was an opportunity there that MIT saw.
It was a site that was very industrial. Many campuses at the time were trying to be in beautiful landscapes. You go to Princeton or Harvard. This was an institution that welcomed the gritty industrial landscape. That was its back door, with factories right and left for early automotive, candy, food, and processing. You look at all the smokestacks, you can imagine the smells.
It was wildly ambitious at the time. You look back now and you think the audacity of this small technical school, sometimes called Boston Tech, to launch itself in such a prominent location with such a big scale.
The move signified that MIT was going to be more than a technical school. It was going to be the high cathedral of science and technology.
Now the question is, what are we going to build? McLaurin wanted a distinctive structure that people would recognize anywhere from around the world, that they would see and know that that was MIT. He gets an unusual opportunity, an invitation to speak to George Eastman, the founder and president of Eastman Kodak. Eastman had been very impressed with a number of MIT alums working for him. They felt this kind of education represented the future. He asks McLaurin how much he thinks he needs, and McLaurin gives him a sum, and he says, fine, I'll write you a check. The provision was he wanted to remain anonymous.
They brought in this architect who was a guy called Childs. He was a sanitation specialist. I mean, what was that guy doing designing a world-class educational institution? No one really knows. So his plan was a complete disaster. And then came an architect who was brought here by the previous president to MIT, Depredel, and he brought in a Beaux-Arts sensibility. Big building, beautiful landscape, on the river, and his drawings were beautiful. Now, you also look at him and you go, this is a very expensive building. Freeman, who is a professor here at MIT, civil engineer, on the design team for Panama Canal, and one of the country's leading civil engineers, comes in and says, well, I can give you a great building. It'll have some architectural flourishes, but very minimum. He was really opposed to sort of what he called beauty doctors, his word for architects.
And Freeman approached the problem like an engineer would. He looked at the requirements, he looked at the constraints, and he began to develop principles to guide the design.
The genius of his argument that really won the day was that it's going to be a concrete building, slabs and columns, and this will allow departments to move or negotiate with each other as to where they want to be.
Freeman recognized that if the buildings were isolated, it would be less productive. If we have a biology building which is separate from a mathematics building or a civil engineering building, then we won't be as able to build and understand how waterways work, for example.
So his argument was MIT needs one mega building and everything open. And then you put in the curtain walls depending on what you need. So he wrote the departmental names at an angle. So he didn't say this is where physics is. He wrote, here's the plan, and then he wrote physics, chemistry, engineering, because they let them figure it out. And that was really sort of the genius, because it appealed to the growth model of what MIT was already experiencing.
The more traditional academic design at the time was separate buildings, much like Harvard, where you have multiple buildings in a yard or in a quad. Here, the idea was to have this interdisciplinary connection of departments, and thereby the architecture supported that.
McLaurin understood the fundamental message that Freeman was making in his plan, but he was worried that the building was not yet going to appeal to sort of the high-level branding consciousness that was emerging. He called up the Rockefellers and said, what would you do in this situation? And Rockefeller said, well, I know a great architect, guy's name's Bosworth. And so they met, they hit it off very well. And basically Bosworth took Freeman's plans and gave them a type of sensibility that Freeman really didn't have. So he added the dome, and he organized the neoclassical language. They're replicas of the Temple of Athena in Priena. And then with the Great Dome being modeled on the Pantheon in Rome, you have, in some sense, this hybrid between the Roman vision of engineering and the sort of the classical and civilizational touch of the Greeks.
Freeman's designs weren't built exactly. He was very upset about this.
Ostensibly, he took all his plans and burnt them. McLaurin, just more or less then announced Bosworth's taking over.
The scale of the undertaking was absolutely immense.
The concrete frame is all hand-built. It was 100 years ahead of its time.
This was the biggest concrete building in the world at the time.
It was really groundbreaking and trailblazing from a construction standpoint, and also from the speed of construction. The buildings went up incredibly quickly. Train tracks were used to move material goods through the site, and it was a very detailed and efficient process.
In a span of 3.5 years of construction, they built over 1 million square feet of space. I think there's only one other building that's been built that fast that I know of, and that's the Empire State Building.
They wanted to provide good ventilation and good lighting. These were crucial elements.
There was this design movement called daylight factory windows, which are very tall windows that allowed light and ventilation to get into the factory floor. And basically what we have at MIT is daylight factory window.
A lot of the materials that are currently found in this building were designed by professors at MIT in 1900. This bubbled translucent glass that you see in the transom and the door panels is a lenticular glass, which was designed by two MIT professors. They wrote a book on it, and it showed the design of how they used this glass to diffuse all of the light that was coming in from the outside floor-to-ceiling windows.
Bringing in the classical themes, the big columns, the capitals, the pediments, the domes, this was a way of stating our importance and our seriousness.
He wanted a building that would survive the ages, and by golly, it did. $1 for a square foot, this has got to be one of the best deals MIT has ever had. The opening was a spectacle of tremendous scale and proportion. I don't think Boston's ever seen anything like this since.
It started with a symbolic ceremony leaving Boston and putting the symbols of the Institute, its charter, its seal, into these casks, and the faculty were dressed in costumes, and they marched from the Boylston Street building down to the Charles River.
And then they designed a special boat that went from one side of the Charles River to the other side.
But this wasn't any old boat. This had to be a reproduction of a Venetian barge. They took a more ordinary boat and they clad it in plaster Paris molds with all sorts of figurines and figures so that it looked like this 11th century vessel. On the front is the goddess who's carrying the torch of progress and a T-square.
And the boat practically capsized.
Spotlights come down, the cannons boom, there's fireworks as they're coming across the river in this flotilla.
And then there was this sort of nighttime spectacle with a light show. And then there was an opera that was specially commissioned for this event on the history of man, which ended with MIT being sort of the end of the history and sort of showing the way to the future.
This is a celebration that concludes with the singing of this anthem, Mother Tech. They concoct a scheme to link not only the 1,000 or so alumni in the room, but the thousands more around the country. And so they wire up 36 MIT clubs all around the country. And every person sitting at a table had a little receiver. And they hear the luminaries on the stage, Orville Wright, Alexander Graham Bell, and a message to the world that science and technology, that education matters.
So it involved the entire Politico of Boston and Cambridge, and it was attended by governors, and everyone who was anybody would have been either at the event or on Mass Ave or on the bridge or somewhere trying to get a view of this event.
It was not just a local newsworthy event, it was a national and international newsworthy event.
If you think of the Olympic opening ceremony and the spectacle, this would have been something equivalent to that in 1916 when they opened it up.
They were staking their claim. They were putting their flag in the ground. This is what we're going to be. We're going to be proud that we're this type of institution, and we're going to excel at it, and we're not going to be apologetic about it.
It was decided in 1920 that George Eastman, that his identity as the principal donor would be revealed. At that point, he'd given about $20 million, and There was a grand banquet set up, and about 2 days before that event, McLaurin got sick, very sick. So sick, in fact, that he died 2 days later. Students carried his coffin up from the president's house. He was only 49 years old. As far as I know, he's the only person who has ever lain in repose in MIT in what we call Lobby 10.
And it pretty much sort of cost him his life. Once the building was here and was instituted, the man practically died on the job.
The drive that President McLaurin had and the MIT faculty and trustees at the time to say, this place cannot just be Boston Tech, it's not enough to have a few more buildings here, we just have to make our presence known. And to come across the river, get this huge piece of land, and then build this massive main group, I mean, that was a remarkable, bold vision.
These buildings today are grand, they're imposing. They were at the time that they were built. They will be 100 years from now. And they make a statement to the world that we have a vision for longevity and durability, and we are here, and we plan to be here for a long time.